Hey, everybody. I'm sitting here with Cheryl Jones, host of the Movies Made Me podcast. How's it going, Cheryl?
Fine. How are you?
Great. Can you tell me a little bit about your podcast?
Yes, we talk about the movies that have influenced you to be who you are.
That sounds like a really hard thing to decide on.
It is. What's one of your influential movies?
Oh, hands down, one of my most influential movies is City Slickers.
I knew that because you've been on my show.
It's true. Oh, it's all a facade.
Hollywood.
How do people listen?
They can listen at mmmpodcast.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and iHeartRadio.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, Quillers. We're so glad that you can join us for another thrilling episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Today, we're going to travel through medieval and Renaissance France for a little bit with our expert. She is Dr. Elisabeth Waugaman, an expert in France and medieval French history. And she, as of late, thanks to the urgings of her husband, Dr. Richard Waugaman, has been applying her expertise to the studies of the Shakespeare authorship question. Elisabeth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about what prompted you to overlay these two topics together.
Well, Richard Waugaman, my husband, has been interested in Shakespeare for many years, especially the theory that Oxford was the actual author of the plays and poems written by Shakespeare. And he asked me to look at the French influence in Shakespeare, which is a topic that until very, very recently, it was just not discussed except in groups who had alternative theories like the Oxfordians. I mean, the Oxfordians have considered this for a long time, but none of this had really gotten into the mainstream. Now, things have begun to change really in 1980 with a book called Libertines and Puritans by Hugh Richmond. And now there's another scholar, Richard Hillman, who is just turning out books. He's churning them out one after another. The third book will come out in January of 2020, which is on the comic in Shakespeare and the French influence. So this is something that is going to radically change how we look at Shakespeare, because in the past, since the theory always was that Shakespeare of Stratford did not know French, which we really have no way of knowing how he could have learned it. I mean, there are theories that maybe he hired tutors, maybe he learned a little French when he was staying with the French Huguenot family in London, but by then he'd already published Hamlet, which has a French source which was not translated. So there's just this gradually accumulating mountain of French studies on the plays that are going to make it impossible to say that Shakespeare did not know French.
So what you've found in your research is that there are profound French influences in multiple plays.
Yes.
And that those influences had to have come from somebody who had not only a knowledge of the French language, but also had to have some knowledge of French history, French pop culture of the day, French artistry. What other layers were a part of your finding?
Well, all of the things that you mentioned, and one of the plays that has really not been appreciated as it should be is Love's Labour's Lost.
I like to call it L cubed. It's just an easier abbreviation because my tongue always trips up on that one too. Love's Labour's Lost.
Yes, well, in the original, there weren't any apostrophes, and there's been a lot of argument about where the apostrophe should be put, etc. But the thing that is just astounding to me is that even in the New Cambridge edition, of Love's Labour's Lost, they continue to say what Stratfordians have always said, which is that Shakespeare didn't know what he was doing when he put the king, the French king, Longueville and Dumaine all together, that these people were not friendly with one another. It never would have happened. So I started reading, and what I discovered was what Shakespeare is doing there at the very beginning of the play is that he is presenting all of the political factions in France at the time. So you have the king, who represents Henri de Navarre, and that's the Protestant. You have Longueville, who was that family, the father and the son, both of them supported Henry of Navarre, and they were belonging to a political group that they called the malcontents, the malcontents, because these were Catholics who were against the other powerful Catholic faction, which was the Guise faction, which is represented by Dumaine, who was one of the Guise brothers. But they didn't want the Guise brothers to take control because they feared they would become too powerful. And then you have Dumaine, who's the Guise, and then you have what you have in any political complex interaction of powers. You have Biron, who's the loose cannon. You don't know what he's going to do. So his primary motivation is just his own self-interest.
Sure.
And what's really interesting about Biron, and this was noted by Hugh Richmond in Puritans and Libertines, is that he would actually speak ill of the king. He would make fun of him, just like he does in the play. So, I mean, that's just, one example of how complex Shakespeare's knowledge was of what was happening in France. I mean, he understood all of this completely. I mean, and it just amazes me that people still have not picked this up after all this time because they've had these blinders on, thinking that he didn't really know what he was doing. Another example is the wonderful scene where the ladies rush in and they're all wearing masks. And we think, oh, how quaint, this is just something that he made up. And, well, if you read French history books of the period, what you discover is that the French court was a little bit like Venice in Carnival. People were wearing masks all the time.
I think they were trying to mimic that behavior from Venice. Wouldn't you say that they were so influenced by that very cosmopolitan city and all that was coming in and out of Venice at the time that they wanted to emulate that to some degree?
Well, that's certainly true because they had an Italian queen, Catherine de' Medici. But the other reason that they were probably running around wearing the masks is that there was so much division in the French court, and you had enemies, next to each other in the hallways. And maybe if you had on a mask, you were a little bit safer. I mean, it's an interesting speculation, but the scene where they're wearing masks is a mirror image of what was going on in the French court. And of course, people had fun with this because if you were wearing a mask, you could play games.
Well, and we see mask wearing in multiple plays in the Shakespeare canon. Obviously, a very famous scene in Romeo and Juliet where they wear masks at the party. There's a famous scene in Much Ado About Nothing where they're wearing masks, and that causes some of the intrigue and problem in that play. Then you have this moment in Love's Labour's Lost. I mean, there are multiple references where he uses masks as a means for characters to disguise themselves from the other characters and get away with certain things that they might not otherwise get away with, or to overhear or to eavesdrop on things and find out information that they otherwise might not be allowed to be privy to as well.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. And that's exactly what was happening in the French court.
So the mask wearing was sort of a a mixed bag for them, is what you're saying. It was something that they used not only for the intrigue and to maybe even separate themselves from some of the conflict that was going on, but in some ways, especially from what I know of French history, I think that putting on the mask was like what we do today when people go to Vegas and they say, well, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? So what happens while you're wearing the mask stays with the mask, right? Is a sort of an aspect of that.
Yes, exactly. And I just think it's so intriguing that, we may look at these plays and think, oh, well, that's quaint. But it's actually what was happening in France and, of course, also in Italy. So this was historically accurate. It wasn't just something that he's making up because it makes the play, more interesting. This was an actual mirror of what was happening in France and in Italy at court.
Okay, well, let's talk about another one. What's another reference that connects France to the plays of Shakespeare, or connects knowledge of France or French history or French culture to the works?
Well, the one that's probably the most impressive, I think, is Macbeth. And when you see how many allusions there are to history in France and what's happening in France and in Scotland, it's just absolutely kind of heart-stopping. And a lot of studies have been done about this, but they're kind of scattered all over the place. I mean, I can try to give you a brief summary, and I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling. The queens who were ruling at the time were Catherine de' Medici. You had Mary, Queen of England, who was then replaced by Queen Elizabeth. You had Marie de Guise, who ruled, and she was replaced by her daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was raised in France and had been married to a French king, Francis II, who died prematurely. So you had three Marys. You had Mary the First of England, you had Marie de Guise and her daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. And then you had Kate, who was Catherine de' Medici. So in my opinion, the witches in Macbeth and Kate represent these Catholic queens. And what was happening with these Catholic queens was that you had religious warfare with, lots of people being killed. And this is completely contrary to the image that we have of the queen as the mother of her country, who is taking care of the children of her country. So this was just totally an aberration. And if you think about Catherine de' Medici, she was also heavily involved in the black arts. She had an astronomer, Ruggieri, who prophesied using mirrors, which we see in Macbeth, that her line would die out. You have the prophecy in Macbeth, which Macbeth misunderstands how he's going to die. And the same thing with Catherine de' Medici. There was a prophecy about how she would die, and she misunderstood it. You have Lady Macbeth, who she says she wouldn't hesitate to kill her own child. And you have Catherine de' Medici, who is willing to sacrifice her children in order to keep the power in the throne. She actually said to her youngest son, Alençon, as he was dying, she said, it's really too bad that you didn't die a few years sooner, because so many people got killed all for nothing, and you didn't accomplish what you were supposed to do. You have Macbeth, who has hallucinations at the dinner table. He thinks he sees the ghost of the king he has killed. And you had Catherine de' Medici, who was at an enormous banquet, and exactly the same thing happens. She startles, she knocks over her glass, and she thinks she sees the ghost of the Cardinal of Lorraine, who was one of the Guise brothers, whom she had assassinated. So it just goes on and on and on and on.
That is a fascinating corollary there. And it also, I wonder, because it always made me wonder why the character, and you're talking about when Macbeth has Banquo assassinated.
Yes.
And I always wondered why the name Banquo is used in that play and for that character, and how it doesn't seem to me to fit with all the other Scottish names that are running around this play.
Well, it's because critics have talked about this a lot, and what they say is that there was supposed to be a lineage for King James, and that Banquo would have represented this, that at some point James would have been king. But there's a lot of...
Banquo is an ancestor of James, and we know that James is an ancestor of is the descendant of a French king, right?
Well, he's the descendant of Marie de Guise and a Scottish king, so he has French blood on the maternal side.
Okay, the maternal side.
Yes, and It's just amazing to me that there's just so much of this French influence in Macbeth. It's just, and I think the reason that Shakespeare does this is that he was extremely worried about what would happen if Queen Elizabeth didn't pick an heir. And you see this, there's this scene at the end of Macbeth in which Edward the Confessor appears. Now, this is extremely strange because the way he's introduced in the play is that he's there because he has the king's touch, which means that he has this power, a God-given power to heal certain illnesses. It was actually scrofula, which was not uncommon, and it was an illness that could, stop and then maybe not come back or come back again later. And anyway, it was the French tradition that the French king could cure this disease through touch. And when Edward the Confessor went over to France to become king, he took this with him. And by the way, Edward the Confessor was the last, and this is ironic, he was the last Anglo-Saxon king, but he was actually raised in France. He was 32 years old when he was called to France to become king. He took all of his French courtiers with him. Only French he was spoken at the court with him and his courtiers. He was in a desperate struggle to maintain his power, and therefore he never had children because he'd been forced to marry into another lineage, which would have been an Anglo-Saxon lineage, and he didn't want to have children because it would have given power to this important family. So he never had children. But the reason he never had children was for political reasons, and it's exactly the same thing with Queen Elizabeth, that she never wanted to get married because she would have had to give up her power. Now, Queen Elizabeth maintained the king's touch. That is, she would go out and she would touch people who were ill with scrofula, with, the idea that at some point with her touch they could be cured. Now, what's really interesting here is that King James I hated this ritual because he considered it to be a Catholic ritual. He didn't want to get contaminated by touching people who were sick, so he actually wouldn't touch them. He would just drop this ribbon over their neck with a medal. So why would Shakespeare put this scene in Macbeth knowing that King James I hated this ritual, wanted to stop it. He did everything in his power to try to stop it. It doesn't make any sense. Now, if he's talking to Queen Elizabeth, then it does make sense because she's continuing the ritual. And I think that's a clue, one of the clues in the play, that the play was written for Queen Elizabeth. And what he's doing in the play, and not James, and what Shakespeare's doing in the play is he's pointing out to her, look, if you're not careful, things are not, King Edward was the last Anglo-Saxon king because he had no heir. You, like him, have no heir, and if you don't do something, you might be the last Protestant ruler of England. I mean, that was a big point of contention that everybody was worried about. Would the next ruler be a Protestant or would he be a Catholic? And of course, most of the English at that point weren't too excited about having a Catholic ruler.
No, not at all. I mean, that was a big part of the nationalism that was going on in the country at the time. And I could see where you make the comparison of the three witches and Hecate and all of these Catholic powers swirling around Elizabeth, wanting her demise, including the Pope himself, who offered special dispensation to anyone who would kill her as being absolved from the sin of murder because she was, quote unquote, the heretic queen.
Yes. So I believe very strongly, if you look at the French influence in Macbeth, what you see is this play was actually written for Queen Elizabeth I. And if you understand it that way, it actually makes a lot more sense than a play written for King James I. The other thing that is really mind-boggling to me is that Macbeth is a play about the women who have the power. It's not the men who have the power in the play. It's the women. And then there's another hint at the end of the play when you have Malcolm coming, and he had a parent who was murdered, and he was a virgin like Queen Elizabeth. And he's doing what he needs to do to ensure that there's a continuation of the line. And so that yet also is another hint to Elizabeth that she needs to do something to secure the royal lineage by, picking somebody. And of course, we know that didn't happen.
Well, and, one of the things that I always found very interesting about the play as well is not only does Malcolm come back and become king, but one of the first things he does as the new king of Scotland is take away all of the thanedoms and turn them into earldoms. And he makes all of his noblemen now new earls of the land, which is a very English thing to do in the land of Scotland, especially in 1053 ADs when the time period would have been. That's when Macbeth actually lived and died. So it is a very interesting statement that's being made by the author of the play at that moment, that there's a new form of rulership, a new form of aristocracy controlling the land under the graces of the monarch. And it is these earls, it is these aristocrats, these courtiers who are now going to heal the country after the fall of the Macbeths. So I think that there's another interesting little statement there in the play that doesn't make sense for it to be a play written for messages to King James, but as you say, for messages to Elizabeth.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yes.
You mentioned a little bit earlier, you talked about Hamlet, and you said that there is evidence that there are also significant French influences in Hamlet. Tell me about that.
Well, Richard Hillman has written a book in 2012 called The French Origins of English Tragedy. Then he wrote another one in 2015 called French Reflections on Shakespearean Tragic. And now in 2020, in January, he's going to have another one coming out called The Shakespearean Comic and Tragi-Comic. And what he does is he's absolutely mind-boggling as a scholar. I mean, he has so many references to not just one or two French works, but to multiple many French authors. And he shows how Shakespeare takes all of these different authors. We're talking about history writers, we're talking about French poets and playwrights, and how Shakespeare is familiar with all of this, and how he weaves all of this together. And Hillman just sees French influences everywhere, and he is going to radically change, I think. I mean, without a shadow of a doubt, he is going to, all by himself, just totally change how we look at Shakespeare's relationship to France and to French writers. Now, what's a little bit ironic with his stance is that he says he thinks Shakespeare's knowledge of French was, like moderate or passable. But other academics who read his books and review them, like Catherine Gousser, says that you can't say this, because if you look at all of the sources that Hillman talks about, I mean, we are talking about, it just seems like an unlimited number of French authors. And he gives no explanation of how Shakespeare could have gotten a hold of all these texts, some of them not very well known. For example, he thinks Jodelle was one of the major influences in Shakespeare's Cleopatra, because Jodelle wrote a play about Cleopatra captive. And you're just kind of buried under all of this information. And again, for people who want to find out what these books are, it's Richard Hillman. The first one was French Origins of English Tragedy in 2012. The next one is French Reflections on the Shakespearean Tragic in 2015. And the one that's coming out in 2020 is the Shakespearean Comic and Tragi-Comic. So this scholar will have had 3 books published on the French influence in Shakespeare, and it's monumental. I mean, it's just breathtaking.
If he's right about these references and these French authors, and we're talking about, I would assume, works that predate the 1580s, they'd have to be.
Oh yes.
Some of the works probably even in the 15th, even maybe as early as the latter part of the 14th century. Perhaps some of these writers, yes.
Well, I think most of them are probably from the 1500s on. But what's really, really interesting when you start looking at the French influence in Shakespeare is you start to find a lot of references to texts that were not published. So, for example, in Love's Labour's Lost, there's that famous line, "Did I not dance with you once in Brabant?" And that's an allusion to a trip that Marguerite de Valois, the sister of the French kings, took to Brabant to try to help her younger brother, Henry of Alençon, advance his political career there, because Alençon had actually been promised that if he could help Brabant fight against the Spanish, they would make him king of the Netherlands. And of course, Alençon was really interested in this possibility, because then that would make him more of an equal with Queen Elizabeth, whom he was courting at the time.
Right.
And it's like an ocean. there's just so much there that it's almost overwhelming to try to talk to it. And as I said, I'm totally new to all of this. So what I'm trying to do is just make people aware of how enormous the French influence is in the works of Shakespeare, because people haven't realized that. Although now, I think with Richard Hillman's books, I mean, everybody's going to know. And even though Hillman, he says, well, I think, Shakespeare had a modicum knowledge of French. I mean, by the time you get through reading 3 books with sources, or, of people like poets like Du Bartas, who is really well known, but still, I mean, it's just, you're just buried under an avalanche of
How
French
can he
influence.
possibly justify holding both positions? How can he, on the one hand, say, here are all of these French writers, French poets, French historians who were writing at the time only in their native language of French, and in some cases...
Well, some of them were translated.
But when were they translated?
Well, I'm going to answer your question for you, because with the number of people, French authors he's listed, and when their translations occurred, you're beyond my scope of knowledge. But what I will tell you is he wants to get his book published, right?
Right.
Well, if he's going to get his book published, he's going to have to say that Shakespeare, his knowledge of French was just, moderate. He can't say Shakespeare was, excellent, superb in his knowledge of the texts, getting a hold of all those texts. He can't say that, because the Stratfordian, the traditional English scholarship is just now, there's a sea change that's beginning to happen. And what they are now saying is that Shakespeare, because they've got this mountain of information that they can't, there's no way to get out of this now. There's just too much information out there.
It is becoming harder and harder for them to hide from this, isn't it?
There's no way, especially now with 3 books from Hillman. There's no way. So what is the new theory now with Stratfordians? Well, the traditional scholarship theory has now become Shakespeare was kind of like a play broker. He was doing some of the writing of the plays, but he was passing all of these plays around to many, many, many different writers, and everybody was putting their 2 cents in. So this is now the new theory, and this and to me, to my way of thinking, this is the beginning of the end, because this is a grand theory. But what is problematic about it is that, okay, we don't have any kind of paper trail for Shakespeare of Stratford as being an author. We know that he had shares in the theater. We know he bought and sold properties. We have a tremendous amount of information about his business dealings, buying and selling wool, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, we don't have anything that pins him down specifically as a writer, which is, when you consider that the Folger website now has something like 382 different documents about Shakespeare, it's very, very strange that there's nothing that identifies him. And they will count, for example, the frontispieces of the plays as evidence that Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays. But if it's a pseudonym, if it's a nom de plume, that doesn't prove anything. I mean, there should be somewhere. And when Shakespeare of Stratford died, why weren't there any eulogies written? I mean, there are just so many questions. Anyway, to get back to what we were talking about, the new theory is that it's multiple authorship. And so they do computer studies, and they'll find 2 words here that belong to Marlowe, 2 words there who belong to somebody else. Well, okay, that doesn't take into consideration that these people probably knew each other and had kind of a common vocabulary. And the big stumbling block is that if there was this much collaboration going on, why is it we don't have one piece of paper explaining this?
That's a really good good question. And another
Because
question
the
I
more
would say
people-
that you have brought up through your research and through the research that you're discussing of these 3 books by Hillman shows where and how did Shakespeare of Stratford ever get his hands on all these French manuscripts?
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, I don't think I ever finished my story about that allusion to we did not dance with you once in Brabant and Love's Labor's Lost and the mission that Marguerite de Valois went on. That was not published. Nobody knew about that unless they had access to the royal mail. A lot of this stuff, I mean, there is actually a scholar now, I don't have the name with me, unfortunately, but who says there is so much knowledge about French politics in these plays that it appears that Shakespeare had access to the royal mail.
So what if the real author actually spent some time in France?
Well, we know that, of course, De Vere did go to France. He did meet Henri III and Catherine de Medici and Marguerite de Valois. He also met Henri de Navarre. We have a letter from the French king to Oxford thanking him for all of his help. So we know that Oxford was, intensely involved in what was happening in France.
And we know that he had an intense interest in music and in culture and in fashion and in theater and in writing poetry of his own. We know all that about him. We know that growing up, he grew up with access to one of the best libraries in all of Europe at the time, his father-in-law's library, William Cecil's library. And it wouldn't be so far-fetched to think that when he arrives in France, one of the first things he might want to do is not only look at beautiful pieces of art that he knows exist there, but also to look at wonderful libraries that he would have had access to as well. And I could guess that he was probably a pretty voracious reader in any language that he spoke. And he spoke multiple languages. We know that for a fact as well.
Yes, and this doesn't have anything to do with the French influence, but it's an amazing story. There was a traditional Stratfordian scholar who pointed out that there was a reference to Beowulf in one of the plays, and there was one copy of Beowulf in all of England, and that was in Lord Burghley's house.
Of course.
And so there you go.
Yeah, he does. He mentions, I believe the mention is of Grendel. Is the reference that you're talking about. I don't remember which play it is, but I believe that the reference from Beowulf that you find in Shakespeare is a reference to Grendel, the antagonist character of Beowulf.
There's another thing that I would like to bring up too, which is that I think one of the reasons we've been so slow to recognize foreign influences in Shakespeare's work is that because our concept of Shakespeare was formed in the Romantic period. And when David Garrick, who was, by the way, the son of French Huguenot refugees, when he brought Shakespeare back and made his plays popular. At the Shakespeare Jubilee in 1769, David Garrick compared Shakespeare. He said of Shakespeare, he is the god of our idolatry, which is a really, really powerful statement. And at the end of the 1700s, there was a lot of debate about what Shakespeare knew and didn't know. Drayton thought he was a natural-born genius, but Pope thought that no, this was a man who had a lot of learning. And then something really interesting happened in 1840, and that was that this amazing historian, Thomas Carlyle, published this book on heroes and hero worship. And this was like at the height of the Romantic era. And he says in this book that Shakespeare is a gift of nature with a capital N. And he says Shakespeare is a bond of brotherhood of all Saxondom. he says Shakespeare is the incarnation of Saxondom. And he even says Shakespeare is beatified. And he says, you call it worship, call it what you will. And then he makes this incredible statement as a historian. He says, you do not meddle with Shakespeare. So, it's like he's putting Shakespeare out there as a monument to Saxondom, and you don't question why. And as we all know, Thomas Carlyle had huge influence, worldwide influence on how people thought about England and its history, and specifically Shakespeare. And that was the beginning of the end of trying to think about any kind of foreign influence in Shakespeare.
But I would argue that I have several colleagues in the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and you yourself in the work that you have done. I would say that there's, as you have said, a mountain of evidence that this writer not only was influenced by foreign influences and other cultures, but I would say that there's a lot of evidence that this. Oh, there we go. There's my phone ringing. I would argue that there's a lot of evidence that this author was Norman in his roots and in his heritage. And what would you say to that idea?
Well, there's a scholar who's made a really, I think, important point, and he said that Shakespeare had to define his work against something. If you're going to define yourself, you either define yourself as being like something or unlike something. I mean, there has to be something else there for people to, have some appreciation of where it is you're standing. And this scholar has said that Shakespeare defined himself in a kind of tense opposition with France and with French literature. And all of this goes back to the psychic wound of the Norman invasion. And Queen Elizabeth signed her name as Queen of England, Ireland, and France. So this was a dream that they'd lost, practically everything. But this was a dream that the English had, that one day they would again reacquire the French lands that had been lost. So here you have this genius who's trying to create an English literature. Well, where's the inspiration going to come from? Well, it comes from France, primarily, I think, but it also, of course, comes from Italy. But if you read the plays and you see, it's because of the political ties that France is so important. It's because of what's happening in France and in Scotland, which is critical for the survival of England. Because if Shakespeare foresaw what was going to happen, he could see that if the king, the government, couldn't maintain control, England was going to have the same problems that France had. There would be a religious war. And that was what he was fighting against in these plays, so many of them. Macbeth, for example.
I sure would like to know what exactly Edward de Vere's mission was when the Queen sent him to the continent. He goes into France first and he spends some time there, and then he heads to Italy. And you weren't allowed to take a trip like that without express permission from the crown and without proper letters of diplomacy, because these countries are not in good standing with each other at the time. He's trying, I believe his time in Venice was in an attempt to try to establish trade. But what's the purpose of going through France, and why does she send him and not someone else? And did he accomplish whatever his mission was while he was there? It would be really interesting to know. And I think that some of the hints of all of that come out in some of these plays that you're talking about.
Well, I think it definitely comes out in Love's Labour's Lost, and I think he would have gone to France with the intent of trying to understand exactly what was going on, because King Henry III was governed by his mother, Catherine de' Medici. He had no children, so who would replace him was a very big question. Meeting Henri de Navarre, Henry of Navarre, would have been also important. They became friends. So it's a very political trip. And if you look at Love's Labour's Lost, there was another play that was Love's Labour's Won. And there's been a lot of speculation about, well, was that a lost play? Well, what I think happened was, I think that Love's Labour's Lost reflects what happened in Nérac when Henry of Navarre and Marguerite de Valois were negotiating a reunion, because they had been separated, because after the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, Henry of Navarre had been forced to convert to the Catholic religion, but he managed to escape. And he went to Nérac, and this was, of course, highly problematic, because the spouses were separated. So the problem was, how were they going to be reunited? Well, Catherine de' Medici went with what they called the Flying Squadron, which was a group of the most beautiful, most intelligent women at the French court. And they were notorious, because whenever Catherine de' Medici wanted something to happen or something not to happen, she would just appear unannounced on somebody's doorstep with these women, called the Flying Squadron, l'Escadron Volant. And that's what she did. She went. And this is what Love's Labour's Lost is all about. It's about the negotiations that were taking place to reunite Marguerite de Valois with her husband, Henri de Navarre, who was going to become King of France. And if the play had stopped with the Treaty of Fleix, F-L-E-I-X, it would have been Love's Labour's Won, because everything was settled at that point. But unfortunately, time keeps rolling on. And what happened was, after the Treaty of Fleix, there was a kind of a disintegration, because religious tensions got to be so severe that Marguerite de Valois actually had to leave, because she was Catholic, and it became actually kind of dangerous for her to stay. So this play, Love's Labour's Lost, in the frontispiece it says that it was augmented. So it was changed and augmented. So it makes sense. If you look at the French history, you see how Love's Labour's Won could have taken place between the two when everything ended well, but with the passage of 2 or 3 more years, then everything was lost. And the French actually refer to this 7th war of religion, they call it the Lovers' War, la guerre des amoureux.
Interesting. That's a very interesting connection right there in itself. And so what you're saying is Love's Labour's Won is like an earlier version of Love's Labour's Lost, is what your theory is.
That's what I think, because if you look at the history, everything looked like it was ending well with this treaty that ended the 7th war of religion, but then very, very quickly it all fell apart.
And you mentioned the connection there to Alençon, right? As well.
Yes.
And then you talked about earlier on about Catherine de' Medici saying to him on his deathbed that he should have died earlier, before all this problem that occurred. And then, of course, there's the very famous account of he and Elizabeth having their courtship and potential marriage discussions, and the basically the English aristocracy squashing that in a variety of different ways. And
yes,
if you think about it, I commonly make reference to A Midsummer Night's Dream, where we have what I believe is very direct reference to Alençon And I think he's lampooned as the character Bottom in that play.
Yes.
And then,
yes.
And here he comes up again in Love's Labor's Lost. It would seem that the writer of the plays had some sort of mild obsession with this particular guy.
Well, if you look at the history from 1560 to 1581, Queen Elizabeth had a series of French suitors. And then from 1562 to 1598, you have the French religious wars. So you can see right away that all of this is critically important for what's happening in England, and therefore it's not surprising that it appears in the plays, although, kind of camouflaged in a way, because there was only so much that you could do before, you ended up getting arrested or, having something terrible happen to you. Ben Jonson was thrown in jail. Marlowe was thrown in jail. And strangely enough, for some reason, Shakespeare never was. Now, why would that be?
Well, we've touched on that a few times in a couple of different episodes, and it is a very interesting question, right? Because here you have a guy who is talking about the closest thing the Queen ever had to a husband, and doing so in ways that you should be killed for, yet no punishment whatsoever. And I would argue that it makes no sense that a guy from Stratford who spends most of his time dealing in grain and hoarding grain and being fined for hoarding grain and petty lawsuits for a few shillings here and a few shillings there, I would argue that he has no place whatsoever having any concern whatsoever for the Duke of Alençon and the Queen's potential marriage. And I would also argue that it speaks that the writer of these plays had a very intimate relationship with the Queen, and that's why he was so obsessed with the idea that she might take this man to be her husband.
Yes, I agree with all of that. I mean, Shakespeare presents in his plays just, incredible things. He makes fun of Polonius. His dictums to his son are like those that Lord Burleigh had for his son. Richard III was a hunchback, and he wasn't in real life, although Burleigh's son had a hunchback. So, I mean, it's just all over the place in so many different ways. And the French influence, is just adding more and more fuel to this fire about how, political these plays were. I mean, if you don't consider the French influence, you don't realize to what an extent these plays are political commentary. And I get the feeling from reading them that, especially with Macbeth, how desperate Shakespeare is to try to get all this sorted out, because he sees that England could go the same way France went, and it would be a disaster. And then he foresaw what was going to happen.
I think you're spot on there. And I think that there is a definite obsession with succession that occurs in this writer, not only in the plays, but also in the sonnets. I think that when you look at plays that otherwise seem to be about one thing, you often can find that no, they're actually about something else underneath, whether it be a political message to the Queen or to other courtiers, or even perhaps to ambassadors from other countries that would often attend these performances, these court performances. And I think when you look at some of the research that's out there and some of the stuff that you yourself have delved into with your expertise and your knowledge, I think that you find that there is a layer of knowledge and information that is there, that is demonstrated there, that just absolutely cannot have been had by any commoner at all. It had to be somebody who was close to the court, who knew about these things, who had their ear to the wall, and who understood the magnitude of what was going on and the players involved and how sensitive the situation could be or could become if somebody did not play their cards correctly in these situations.
Oh, I agree completely. And I'll give you one more example of something that I found that just really practically set my hair on fire. There's that amusing little interlude in Love's Labor's Lost where the noblemen dress up as Russians.
Russians, yes.
And everybody has always said, well, it's because Queen Elizabeth had the Tsar was courting her, which is true. But in digging through all of this stuff, I discovered that there had been a French mask that was put on with Russians. And what becomes really chilling about this, why are the Russians so much in the news? Well, they were in the news in France and they were in the news in England, and they weren't in the news in France because the Tsar was courting Queen Elizabeth necessarily. But what was happening in Russia at the time was that Russia was fighting with Muslims who were invading from the south. So Russia had a religious war going on at the time. And there's a very subtle reference to this that Shakespeare makes for people who knew, they would have understood. He talks about the blackamoors. And the Moors, of course, are Muslims. So this is another tiny little hint in this play that, the religious warfare is an important issue. It's just this subtle little thing. And it would have been for people who really knew what was happening in politics, not just in England, not just in France, but even in Russia.
And this coming from a writer who eventually writes a play all about the difference of religions when it comes to Christians and Jews with The Merchant of Venice, and that very, very poignant speech that Shylock delivers when he says, "Does not a Jew bleed?" As he says, yes. I am just as human as you are. And it shows a pattern throughout these plays of a writer who was very cognizant of what differences in religion could do to people and what it could cause, and the dangers and the damages that it could cause when you had these types of religious conflicts going on throughout the known world that he had his thumb on, that he obviously had an ability to keep track of.
Yes. And today, of course, we don't really know most people don't really know the history that well. So I think a lot of this, for example, Love's Labor's Lost was, for a long time, it was considered to be a bad play. It was just this thing about, all this silly wordplay, and then there's this terrible ending where the king dies, and that's just such an artificial ending. Well, that's actually what happened. Alençon died. So it's historically accurate.
Some theorize that he was poisoned, that he was murdered.
Well, all of the Valois kings had tuberculosis. So Francis II died when he was, I don't even know if he was 20. I think he was 18. Charles had terrible TB, and when he died, he sweated blood. And his nurse said each drop of blood represented the soul of one Huguenot he had killed in the Bartholomew Day Massacre. And Henry III had an open, I don't even know what you call it. He had a place on I think it was his face or his arm that wouldn't heal. It was TB. And if he hadn't been assassinated, he would have died from TB. And Alençon, it was the same thing. They all had TB. And it's amazing that Margot the sister was just absolutely indestructible. But she was infertile. She couldn't have children. So the family was just really cursed.
Right. It really does. It sounds like a terrible, terrible curse.
they were all sick. And of course, in these days we could have cured it, but back then they didn't have a cure for it.
No, and I wonder if there's a connection there too. I don't know how much work you've done on All's Well That Ends Well, but obviously another play that involves a French king and a French king who's very sick and dying, and Helena, of course, brings her medicine to him and cures him, and that's how she ends up with the husband of her choice who doesn't really want her. And I'm wondering how much French influences we could find in a deeper dive into that text as well.
Well, you're getting beyond what I actually know about. Like I said, I'm really, a newbie to all of this, but I am absolutely positive that Richard Hillman talks about it because he has 3 books about, the French influence in Shakespeare's plays. So we've got a lot of reading to do.
Well, I'm so glad that your husband not only introduced you to the Shakespeare authorship question and Oxfordianism, but I'm also glad that he encouraged you to combine your expertise and interest in French history and French writing and overlay that with this issue of authorship. And I'm certainly even more grateful to him that he encouraged you to contact me about being a guest on this program, because it's been a fascinating conversation that we've had today.
Well, thank you so much. And like I said, I'm really brand new to this, but I really recommend that everybody go out and try to get a hold of Richard Hillman's books. And I see here in my notes that he does talk about the French influence in All's Well. So he's, if you want to know anything about French influence, he's the guy to go to, because he now, as of January, he will have 3 books. 3 books. It's just amazing. 3 books on this subject.
But he rides the line of, but Shakespeare only had very rudimentary knowledge of French.
Well, he doesn't say rudimentary. He says a kind of basic understanding. But there again, things have not gotten to the point that you can really get away with this. I'm amazed that in 1980, the book Puritans and Libertines got published, because in that book, that's Hugh Richmond, who wrote that. And in that book, he actually says that the characters who are depicted in Love's Labour's Lost were not imagined. They were observed. That is breathtaking. And he managed to get his book published. Wow.
That's true. And there are a lot of publishers out there who shy away from anything to do with this topic, as many of our scholar colleagues have found, and which is why quite a number of them are self-published and have gone about it independently. But I do think, as you pointed out earlier in this episode, I do think that there is a paradigm shift happening. I do think that we are on the cusp of something very big when it comes to the acceptance of truth, and truth in research, and truth in questioning, which is one of the biggest purposes of this program. And what we ask all of our listeners to do each and every episode is to keep asking questions about this, because the truth is there, and we will get to it if we continue to do the research and we continue to look at the research objectively, without, as you pointed out earlier, that illusion of the god of our idolatry, and the mythology of the Stratfordism, or as some of our previous guests have pointed out, the amusement park aspect of it all, and the Disneyland connection aspect of Stratford-on-Avon now, that is such a multi-million-dollar business and industry that's part of what prevents people from looking at this open-mindedly. But I think, as you say, it's changing. It is starting to shift. And as one of the things I've been saying all year, and since the advent of this podcast series, it's a great time to be an Oxfordian.
Yes, I certainly agree. And as far as the Disneyland, aspect to it, what I tell people is that, there will always be Stratford-on-Avon. People will always go there. Shakespeare of Stratford will always be part of the story, but they can add a second stop on their tour, which would be to go see places that were important to the Earl of Oxford.
Like Castle Hedingham, for instance.
Yes.
That would be a good place to start. Well, and I would say again, Elisabeth, and you mentioned several times you called yourself a newbie, and you mentioned that you're new to this whole thing. And the truth of the matter is that's a whole point and part of the big point of this podcast series. A lot of our listeners are new to all of this. A lot of them are just hearing about these things for the very first time. I get comments and responses from people all the time, and quite often a huge number of them are comments or questions that begin like this. I never knew that. Wow. That's so interesting. No one ever told me that. No one ever taught me that in school. And so we're helping to spread that knowledge for people just like you who are fairly new to it, who are now intrigued by it and want to know more. So we want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your bit of information that is just another piece of this puzzle that is starting to come together. I think we're at a place now where the border is completed on this 1,000,000-piece jigsaw puzzle that we've been working on for 100 years now. And I think as we continue to put pieces into the middle, the picture will become clearer and clearer to all of us. And eventually it may look like exactly what it looks like on the box.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me, and thank you for your patience. Like I said, I am a newbie, so there are huge holes in my knowledge about this subject. But what I have discovered is just so fascinating, and when you see how much it adds to the meaning of the plays, I mean, there's no way that this can't be right, because we're understanding the plays. We're beginning to understand the plays the way a Renaissance English audience of, the nobility, of course, would have understood these plays. We're adding dimensions back that we've lost with the passage of time as we've forgotten the history.
I absolutely agree. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's one of the reasons why, as a theater professional, it's so important to me to know this information, because I believe it strengthens my ability to tell these stories whenever I put a Shakespearean production on the stage. Having all of this background knowledge, all of this information, knowing the layers of the text and the meanings behind the characters and the situations, and knowing the references that are being made and the literature that is the source material for these plays, only enlivens the production, only strengthens the performance, and I hope in that sense also then creates a more entertaining experience for audience members as well, even if they don't have all of that information and don't know all of that information.
Oh, I agree. And there's nothing like a good dramaturge to help people with their little holes.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And like I said, I feel like I'm just kind of a courier, bringing the news that I've found to people to let them know about all of this. And, as a cause is dying, things can get even more fiery. And I think that, things have gotten so ugly about just this closed-mindedness. I mean, Abel Lefranc in 1910 said there's no way you can read these plays and not think that whoever wrote them knew an awful lot about France, the French language, politics, on and on and on. He said, if you have, and this is Lefranc, he said, for people with an open mind. And that's the key.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely agree. And I think we're on our way. And don't forget, every major revelation began with someone who just began by scratching the surface. So if you've only scratched the surface of this so far, there's plenty more to find, I'm sure. And I can't wait to hear back how much more information you have as you dive into some of these other plays. and connect them more to the French influences behind them. Thank you again, Elisabeth, so much for joining us on this episode. It's been a fascinating conversation. We want to remind our listeners that they can stream any and all of our episodes from any of their podcast providers. Please go and do that. If you haven't heard them all, you need to catch up. There'll be more coming, one every 2 weeks. That's our commitment to you, fellow Quillers. Don't forget to visit the shop, get your Quiller swag. We'd love to see it out there. And if you need more information, please visit ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org. It is your source and resource for everything Shakespeare authorship question related. I'm your host, Stephen Sable, signing off and reminding you to keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.